I'm going to welcome our specialist to talk about Kenya's take on COP29.
Good evening, everyone. Now, this is probably one of the most challenging things that any politician has to do, which is to sit with fellow politicians, one, and two, have a political conversation as the last conversation at an eco festival. My name is Tendai Mtana, and I am the founder of the Mwerekera Conservancy. In my past life, I have been a politician and a practitioner of government, and so matters related to COP are not new to me. But today is not about me. Today is about us helping each other understand what this big conversation called the Conference of Parties is. And so I'm going to allow the great panel here to introduce themselves. We were having animated conversations about who saw who in Baku. And what happened in Baku stays in Baku, literally. But we're going to allow ourselves to introduce, and we'll, I guess, work our way from left to right. Elizabeth, over to you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Watuti. I am an environmentalist and a climate justice advocate. I'm also the founder of the Green Generation Initiative, where we're working with children, young people, and local communities, helping them to build their own resilience to climate change through local action with simple steps like growing trees in schools. And I also advocate for water conservation. So basically the linkages between how climate change is affecting water and how climate change is affecting biodiversity and how all those issues are related, including nature. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Ubura. I live here in Lifi and a parent at the school. I'm a coral reef scientist, and I have a non-profit research organization in Mombasa called Cordio East Africa. And we study coral reefs, fisheries, like we were talking in the morning panel about saving our seas, but also climate change. I've been very involved in climate discussions because of coral reefs, and now I'm coming out from doing primary coral reef research more into the science policy space around the COP. So this is how we bring science, the results from science and research into the policy frameworks, such as the COPs, to try and help inform better decisions from the decision makers. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Dorcas Wakio Mugo, also environmentalist. I am also the founder of MPI. We work to empower women and girls to take up leadership positions in climate action. And I also work in the mangroves restoration projects in Funzi Island. And I'm so honored to be here.
A wonderful afternoon to you all. My name is Ledama Masita. I'm a marine conservationist working mainly with coastal communities, but also a climate storyteller. I do nature documentaries for BBC, CNN as well. But also one of the frontline leaders for the Global Alliance for Future of Food, where we advocate for the voice of marginalized and indigenous communities at events like COP.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me at the back. Are we clear? Can you hear us? Okay, so let's dive right in. So Elizabeth, I'm going to speak with you first. I'm not sure how many people in the audience here actually know what COP actually is. Not what it means, but what it is. In your own words, and through your lens, what is COP?
So I like to use components that people can relate with, and I just want to begin with the aspect of water. I don't know how many of you know where water comes from. Maybe some will say water comes from the taps, but water does not come from the taps. It comes from the catchments. It comes from places that people have protected. Somebody has planted a tree somewhere, and because of that aspect of them conserving, then we get the rainfall and the water flows across communities, across countries. And I used that to explain the fact that most of the challenges we face, they could be local, but what has caused some of these problems, they are global. It could be because of problems that have been caused elsewhere. And that is the same aspect with climate change. When we see the droughts affecting different parts around the world, and even right here in our country, when we see the extreme floods that we haven't seen for a long time, this is because of impacts that have been created for a longer period of time with the pollution that we've seen all around the world. And with COP, this is a platform that allows the leaders from all around the world. So we have presidents, we have organizations coming in, we have leaders from all around the world. Basically, everybody is part of the COP process as a stakeholder. And this is a platform that people come together to make decisions, well, about how we will make a difference and how we are going to address climate change and in a bigger perspective. And when you talk about COP, there are many COPs. So there is the biodiversity, there is climate, there is the certification. So all these are platforms that are created so that leaders can come together to basically discuss about our future, to discuss about what they will do different to make these impacts change, and also what they will do different to make sure that there is action happening on the ground.
Okay. Are we good? Okay. So David, I'm looking at the audience here, and the people that I see here, generally I could make one general assumption. These folk don't trust politicians. They don't trust politicians, so why should we even pay attention to a COP conversation?
Why go to COPs? So that's a really good question. And as Liz said, the COPs are where governments go to, the leaders go to represent their interests. And they call it a conference of parties. That's where the term COP comes from. But the challenge is that you have like a COP for climate change, you have another one for biodiversity, you might have another one for water or food or another issue. And these are different representatives from different governments that come to negotiate their interests. And sometimes they agree, quite frequently they don't agree. So I was at the COP16, the biodiversity COP, a few weeks ago. The numbers just, they go up from one to the next. And I had been listening one evening to this just terrible disagreement between the countries. Why is the delegations sit there, they argue about different things, they have different positions. Sometimes they can't really say exactly what they should say, so they say something else to get behind it. And the people who are there know what they're saying and why they're saying that. But to be polite, you don't really call a spade a spade. And I thought this is the worst possible thing to be happening. But the next morning I woke up, the news was full of North Korean troops who are now on the ground in Ukraine, fighting Russia's war in Ukraine. And I realized that what these COPs do is two things. One is they came about after the Second World War, and they came about because in the United Nations system, to get governments to come together so they don't go to war together. So even if they are just sitting there disagreeing, at least they're doing it every year or every 2 years, so they're not going to war after 10 years. And you can understand the disagreement, and maybe it'll change in a few years' time. So don't trust what the politicians are saying. But what the COPs also do, and this is where we all come in, is that the COPs provide a place for everybody else to come as well. And as we were saying in the conversation before, suddenly we're hearing about COPs all the time. Everybody wants to go to the COPs, there's so much happening. That's because I think in a way civil society is taking the space that the governments are leaving blank, and we're taking it and we're doing a lot of good things with it. And so that's why we need to go there, listen to the politicians, but understand what they're not saying so we can do the right things.
Okay, so David, here's my question. I'm looking for Miss Mina. When I saw her earlier, and I'm looking for Sir Bill, who are teachers at Kivukoni. And the reason I'm looking for them is, so Kivukoni recently took part in a Model United Nations simulation in Mombasa. And some of the students were they essentially simulated a climate conversation, and they represented the country of Nigeria. And I don't know how they did, but What I'm now going to ask Dorcas is, Dorcas, you out of, I think, the panel here look like the one who was in school in most recent history. How can we get COP to be understood, yeah, at schools like Kivukoni?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So I'll give my experiences on what happened. So last year in Dubai, that's when we had the COP28, and it was my first time attending COP. Just from school and everything, you're new to these spaces. And when I got there, actually the first day I was so lost. I'm like, what the hell is happening here? Everybody was moving so fast. Everybody was going to meetings. Then the rooms were like, meeting is here. I missed quite a number of meetings. Then when I went to these meetings, there were very technical terms used in COP. So what I would recommend is that we can have like sessions in schools like here Kivukoni, where there can be lessons on how young people can become negotiators and also take part in these policy making processes. And also when they find themselves in such a very big and technical space, they can be able to make their voices heard, they can be able to take part in decision making, they can be able to fit in very easily compared to how I experienced my first time last time. But this year when I went to COP29, it was kind of easy for me to navigate because I was like, okay, this is how it goes. These are the terms they use. So I went and did my homework, and then I'm also aspiring to go to a school. I'm going to get more tips on how I can become a negotiator. So it's all about learning and having these sessions in school to train young people on how they can take up the spaces from getting knowledge at first.
Okay, so thanks, Dorcas. Now, Ladama, you occupy two spaces. At least in my opinion, you do. One is the world of media, where you report great stories from the perspective of the organization you work for or report into. And the other is with communities that are on the shorelines. Okay. COP, media, communities at the shoreline. What's the connector for you?
Climate change affects us all. Whether you're by the ocean, whether you're up a mountain, in a desert, in America, in Nigeria, in Kenya, we are all going to be affected by it in one way. And we all have a part to play in the solution. But what happens is certain voices can get drowned out because COP is quite a big platform with politicians, top business people. Yes, media have their part to play, but they're deciding the actions that the world is going to take for climate change. Communities should be involved in those discussions. Children should also have a voice in those discussions. Many different stakeholders should have a voice in those discussions. So for me, it was not only a pride, but I find it a little bit of a duty. When we find ourselves in some of these spaces where these discussions are being had, to bring these marginalized communities closer. And so for me, that's where it all links to. And at times, or often, these communities have lived in balance with nature for so long. They've got nature's time-tested blueprint to sustainability, to resilience. So COP has a lot to learn from them. And that's where the media aspect comes in and helps create that awareness, helps bring those stories to the world, and hopefully can impact these discussions a bit.
David, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to make a sweeping statement, but let's power on this one. Climate's change. Yeah. Climate's just like the human physiology changes. Why are we blaming developed countries?
Because we should. Okay, no thanks. You told me you were going to push my button on that one. So yeah, so climate there's the only constant in nature is change, because nature is always changing. The issue about climate change that we're going through now is that it's changing at scales and speeds much faster than normal background rates. So we've been in a very stable climate for about 8,000 years. So one of the big arguments around planetary boundaries is that, humans have been around for about 70,000 years. probably. Climate has been very stable for 8,000 years, and in that time, our societies have flourished across all the continents. You know, even in the last 1,000, 2,000 years. So we live in a very sweet spot of climate that is very good for human beings. And because of the way we're using the resources of the planet, the pollution, we're taking out too much and we're putting in too much pollution, carbon dioxide, that is changing the climate so quickly that it can't buffer, it can't sort of resist the changes that we're imposing. And we're pushing it out of that comfort zone that is very good for us. That kind of change has not been documented, it's not a natural change. And when you look at the science has developed a lot and the models, our understanding of carbon dioxide, now what they're able to do is, like when you look at the recent climate impacts in Spain, the floods in Valencia, we were just talking about this earlier, is within a few days the climate modelers can come in and say, well, that amount of rainfall was 3 or 4 times more likely because of the amount of climate change we've had. If we had not had anthropogenic climate change, it would have been much less likely that that would have happened. And so that's the science is so good now that I think there's of course many people who are climate deniers still, but they're on the fringe. Now people are really making decisions about, okay, we really need to think about how things are changing and how do we do that, because we are driving the system.
Thanks, David. I'm going to turn to the audience. I don't know if someone can help me with a microphone. The 4 politicians on the stage here who have just come back from COP are fresh off the airplane. And what's the one question you want to ask them? Which is the one thing you want them to address when they get on the plane next year? Because I'm assuming they're going to go back again. But really, what's the story that you want to change around COP? Because I'm assuming you all know what COP is, otherwise you wouldn't be sitting at this auditorium. So, anyone? What's the one question or the one thing you want to see done differently at COP? Or you may have a question about COP. The gentleman over there.
Thank you so much. This is a very powerful conversation, because first of all, I personally do not have a clear understanding of what this COP is, but so many people expect me to have an answer whenever they ask me what is COP. But my question is, from the numbers now we are at COP29, it means that these meetings, all these gatherings have been happening. Have we achieved anything from the previous meetings? Because from what I might not remember the name, he said that most of the time you go there, you quarrel, so that you quarrel for 1 year, so that we don't fight in another 10 years. Is there something that we have achieved from the last COP? Because you have mentioned that there are different conversational, different aspects that you talk about. You went for 16, you talked about biodiversity. Is there anything that was achieved from that conversation?
Okay, David, I think that was addressed to you.
Okay, so you're right. So COP16, the one we just had for biodiversity in Colombia, there was one important change that happened at that COP. There was a very disappointing finish. It hasn't in fact finished. They left it so late that people left to go and get their planes, and they had to stop the meeting because there was not a quorum left anymore to finalize. But one good decision came out was that they officially, and it's been a big argument for a long time about indigenous people and local communities feeling very unrepresented by their national systems. And of course, that's probably not a surprise to many people who are here, because either you know about that, we work with insect spaces, or you are from a community and you felt that you haven't been well represented. So COP16, they decided that there's a permanent forum for indigenous people and local communities to represent themselves in the political space. So that's just an internal decision, but it's an important step in recognition of having done things wrong in the past. So we're hoping, the next few ones will have much bigger steps, but of course, you count the wins that you have.
All right, thanks, David. Count the wins that you have. Dorcas, what makes for a good negotiator?
Okay, so I'm still yet to find out, but from what I have seen, you have to be knowledgeable, you have to know the language, because you just don't go and just start arguing with politicians. There's a way you need to address the question in a certain way that I'm yet to find out. And also you need to connect yourself with other negotiators who have been there before to guide you on how you can do it. So I'm still in the process, but for you to be a good negotiator, it means that whenever you attend these conferences, you'll be able to sit at the table with the politicians or the leaders and able to ask them and to hold them accountable. And then you can ask them difficult questions, they can answer you and give you feedback or something. So,
okay, yeah. Elizabeth, Monasa is in the room, and Monasa is a prolific negotiator. What makes for non-violent negotiation, and what makes for a negotiated outcome where, literally, as David said, if we have to go to war, we go to war? What's the difference? Or what's your preference?
Well, I think in a COP process, like any other political process, we have to look at all perspectives and whatever it is that we can do to make and have like a successful outcome. I've seen that happen in the COPs. So Baku for me was my third COP. And the most frustrating thing about the COPs from my lens is the fact that I feel like things are very slow. Things like tend not to move quite as fast as possible. And that is where the aspect of negotiations also comes in, that you know, if you have to work out because the deal does not make sense for you, I think that there are times when that happens. And we saw that happening in Baku when the small island states actually walked out of the COP at a point when the much needed finance that the developing countries are asking of from the developed countries, which was $1.3 trillion, but then it ended up getting to only $300 billion, and that's by 2035. So there was a lot of frustrations from the negotiators from the small island states because they felt like their perspectives and the fact that for them, you know, they are not waiting for impacts of climate change to come in the future. It's happening right now. And if you're saying that we have to continue receiving pledges, just getting commitments that are never met, then it can be frustrating. And I think that's one of it. And then secondly, within the COP process, there are two zones. So there's usually the blue zone where you have now the leaders and the politicians have access. They can get in there and do the negotiations. And then we have the green zone as well. That's the general public can be able to access that. But the most important thing is the things that I've seen change in the COP, it has been mostly because of the push from civil society in the outside, the young people, the people that are putting pressure to the leaders inside, putting them in the watch, saying, you know, we're watching you, we're listening to anything that you're making in there, and we're going to hold you to account for that. I think for me, that has been something that has made some of these things happen. I saw that happening in COP27 in Egypt when we had, for 30 years, they've been discussing about the loss and damage fund, and it keeps being pushed on until COP27 when they finally accepted to have it in the agenda, and then it was one of the outcomes. And that's a fund that could be helping communities that are being displaced, that are losing their lives and their livelihoods from the impacts of climate change. But it had to take the voices from civil society, from communities to push from the outside for that to happen, which I don't think is fair enough. But I think we have to keep up the fight. We have to push and make sure that we're not allowing the wrong decisions to be taken in the inside. We have to use our voices, even if we're on the outside. But like what Dorcas said, even when we have an opportunity, how do we train our young people, more and more people within the civil society space to get on those seats and also become young negotiators in there so that they can be able to push for some of these interests inside the rooms where the leaders are making the decisions.
So basically, Elizabeth, I can see where the clubs are coming from. Basically, Anguka Nayo.
Yes, kabisa.
All right. Okay, so Ledama, frameworks. You know, part of why civil society pushes, and pushes the boundary, pushes the envelope, to the extent, like she said, where small states are walking out, keeps the conversation going. But there's this phrase, framework. It's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it's a framework. And any framework is designed for a specific objective. Now you work for and with media. Media are also framers of conversations. Which is which? Do we listen to the politicians who are framing us within our state idea? Media are communicating? Or what frame should we be walking through?
That's actually a really, really good question. You saved the hardest one, huh? But media reports, media reports, and even in the reporting, you're right, there is some framing which is done to certain agendas. But at the end of the day, there's a way to also track negotiations. There's a way to track how these are developed. There's a way to track how agendas are coming on board. And it actually starts within the country. So COP is not just those 2 weeks that happen in November. It is a process that starts almost at the start of the year. Many meetings, many smaller local conferences which build up to maybe a regional level, from the regional level to national discussions. And then you've got continental discussions which take place. And these negotiations at certain levels continue happening. Agendas are shared, which eventually build up to those 2 weeks at COP. So when you want to now understand the framework that is being created, it starts with being in touch with these discussions from the very beginning. And I think that's something that we're very poor at, especially in the media sense. So the media only covers the 2 weeks at COP. But really the media should be sharing what is going on in these discussions building up to COP. And and also in these discussions, these are the opportunities for us to contribute to this framework as well, give our thoughts, insights. There's a wonderful platform called Local Conference of Youth, where youth are able to now start to make their entry point into influencing some of these agendas and sharing their voices. So when it comes to which framework do we listen to, which framework do we adhere to, this is for all of us to contribute to this framework. So ideally it should be ours and we should get involved.
Brilliant. David, you had your mic.
Yes, thanks. I'd wanted to say as well is that what's really important is to understanding the framing that is being presented and who's presenting it. Why are they presenting it that way? What's their interests behind the scene? If you understand their interests, you can see what they're trying to get to. Because of course some people try and hide things. One of the things that the science platform I'm working with, IPBES, it invests a lot in trying to make sure that we're not just looking at science, but we're looking at indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, and being inclusive of multiple values, multiple perspectives from around the world of all cultures, basically. So how do you try and make sure that the frames that we're listening to are fully inclusive, and then how do you make sure that you're including all the relevant frames in moving forward? And of course that's very complicated. And the COP processes, they need to in the end accommodate this, because they are our governments talking to each other. But it's very hard work, and it takes both working with the negotiators, working with the media, working with social media and the youth and interest groups, all presenting their interests to try and make sure that all of the frames are being included.
Guys, all of this because the climate is changing. I'm looking at the audience. Any questions from yourselves to guys fresh off the plane from COP? Or should I come back to them again and break this down further? Any question? Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I'm visiting from Germany and I live in Bonn, and I work in an office directly next to the UN building now. And there are 2 COPs every year. They have the preparatory COP in Bonn every May or June just before. And I think that's where they create a lot of the agenda. And for 15 years I've been coming out of work and I've been watching these people swarming to the UN building. There's about 3,000 or 4,000 people swarming back to their hotels. At the start of the 15 years, there were always demonstrations. Now there are no demonstrations, and the people would swarm backwards and forwards. And if I go and try to speak to them, they walk straight past me. I just feel that the whole operation is ignoring the planet.
Okay, that's... So Elizabeth, are we, and like I asked, all of these conversations to discuss a change in climate, are we ignoring the planet?
Yes, and I want to tie that concern to two panels that I've listened to today. We've heard a lot about eco-anxiety, and this is the frustrations that we're seeing, especially with young people, children, and like civil society. And my understanding, definitely there's that feeling that we're definitely ignoring, we're not acting as fast as we should. And if you listen when someone is talking about eco-anxiety, they're not actually scared about the problem. They're not actually scared about the fact that these impacts of climate change are becoming more and more intense, like the floods, the heat waves around the world, the droughts. That's not even the most scary part. The scary part is the fact that even with these impacts becoming more and more intense, there's almost nothing being done about it. So that is where the scary part, the eco-anxiety is coming from, the fact that the action that is needed to address these impacts is nowhere close to where it needs to get. And I think that is something that definitely justifies the fact that we're not really serious about addressing the impacts of climate change. But also, there's a different part of it about what we can do from our perspectives, because I believe for me also action can actually come from the local level upwards. If we can be able to do whatever it is that we can do within our countries, because like you mentioned, these leaders, when they come to COP, they've already decided what they're coming to do and what they're going to come and say. They already have their positions well figured out. So it becomes very difficult to push them within the 2 weeks to make a different stand on what they already came thinking about and what they already decided inborn and throughout the year what they're going to do. So I think it needs to come from a push even at the country level. Like, for example, in Kenya, how well have we questioned maybe like our contributions as a country? Go to the countries in the West as well. How is every country contributing in terms of addressing climate change, and how do we make sure that we strengthen the movements in those countries so strong that by the time the leaders are coming to the COP, the decisions are speaking to the people, because they have to speak to the people. And if they're not speaking to the people, it means that they're not making the right decisions. Because if we're doing this for the people and the planet, then we have to make decisions that are not on the personal interests of the leaders or on the personal interests of like the geopolitics, but it has to be on the interests of what the people actually need.
So as we wind up, so it sounds to me as a student of history that, and David, you put this really well, that what we're calling the Conference of Parties exists within a UN framework. If we were to look back 100 years, was probably about the time when the world was beginning to think about the need for a United Nations framework around the League of Nations conversation. So technically, we're actually talking about something that's very new in the history of mankind, because you talked about 8,000 years. The reason I'm asking that is, you've all talked about media, there's the issue of whether it's relevant, there's the issue about civil society. Are we at the point of change, perhaps? Because if 100 years ago there was no UN, and today, if we're having a United Nations conversation, to my brother's point here, where we're disagreeing so that we don't fight in 10 years' time, could it be possible, and this is to a question I'm posing to you as your closing statement, what's the story we want to change that will make this subject of climate change real and participatory for the people that are here? So that it's not just a political conversation that people get on a plane to and go and negotiate, but if it's actually something that's relevant to the community, what's the one thing we need to change? Because it's evident we're coming to an end of an age and a new one is beginning. So, Ledama, we'll start with you. And you have 2 mics you're being given.
Firstly, one thing that needs to happen, which would really turn things for the better, is certain states, developing states, need to put their money where their mouth is. As simple as that. Because there is definitely the funds out there to start making a change and a difference. It's now, how do we get it actually given, shared, into action, into circulation? And then also one thing I saw is the gap between civil society and state actors, negotiators, it's growing. It was very evident at this COP. And we need to come together even further, and that starts with the language. Linking to the point made earlier, we need to start understanding that language better, but also I feel like the negotiators and that space needs to come closer to civil society as well.
Okay, I'm not sure whether it's that microphone or because it seems to be cutting. Can you still hear us? Okay. All right, Doc. What's the story you want to change?
Yes, the story I would want to change is in terms of the meaningful participation of the youth in decision-making processes. We have been fighting for this for so long, and I think there is need for, sometimes you find you have the badges, but you can't have access to where these deals are being made. You might have the pink badge, the party badge, but you still find when you go there, you're told to keep quiet because the lead negotiator is the one to tell you what to say. So you find sometimes it's difficult. So there's need for meaningful participation of the youth and also for the women, for indigenous communities to be found in these places, because we always say there's nothing about us without us.
Okay. David, before you speak, I want the microphone to go to Mwanase. Mwanase, what needs to change at COP? Oh, sorry, there's someone else?
Thank you for soliciting my input. I was actually just working on framing a question. I feel like one of our biggest challenges is about integrity when it comes to discussions around climate. We have, a lot of climate finance, which is coming from big polluters. We have people who are destroying our environments, then offsetting through carbon credit. We have money coming in to support governments to do positive things that are reactive, that's not reaching its destination. We're afraid to make drastic decisions that would be more preventative and strategic and actually reduce the negative impact, but we're okay to spend billions to try to mitigate or adapt. So I think one of the biggest challenges, and I think this is from government level to even to CSO level, we have CSOs spending hundreds of thousands of shillings to sit in 5-star hotels and talk about climate issues. So I'm not, there's some good work being done. But for example, we have our National Tree Growing Day that we spent 26 million on choppers to fly 10 heads of state around the country to go water a tree here and there while trying to offset carbon and to reforest. So until we have more integrity in the space, which doesn't enable business and multinationals and personal wealth and politics to influence the outcome of our climate, of our earth, of our land, we're going to have continuous problems. So I think rather than being hopeful that things are going to change, with that 26 million, for example, if that went into CBOs who are doing reforestation, generating livelihoods, putting money back into communities, actually actively planting. So I guess, we're not going to wait for integrity to come from those who have personal interest in the space. So my challenge to us is how do we bring more integrity into our own spaces and into the conversation, because the narrative that we have to, the language we have to use to be a part of that conversation, I don't think is one that actually brings the active change that we need. So how can we continue to bring integrity and practical actions and be willing to make sacrifices so that we can actually try to reduce negative impact and build a more conscious future.
Thank you, Manasseh. So David, integrity. What's the story we need to change?
So, no, thank you, Manasseh. So I couldn't agree more with everything that Manasseh just said. And the word that I was going to say, where I hope this is changing to in the COP world, so I think there are three words that are very linked. One is integrity, another one is justice, another one is equality. So the United Nations frameworks that we have now and the COPs that we have, these were designed after the Second World War, so this is in the 50s and the 60s, when the world was very different from what it is now in so many different ways. But one of the most important is that the global sort of governance system was led by Europe and the US at that time. Almost all countries on this continent were still colonies at that time. So and we're talking a lot about reforming the United Nations, reforming the global financial architecture. So until we have a new architecture that reflects the reality of today, which is the diversity of countries we have across cultures, the diversity of communities, indigenous groups, and so on that we recognize, women, youth, full inclusion, and so on. Until the system really reflects that, we won't be able to deal with the real challenges that we have today. So I would see the reform needs to be along those lines. So integrity, justice, and equality. If we have those three principles in mind, we can solve all of the problems.
Thank you very much, David. So Elizabeth, you who has the last word. Next week, is it next week? Well, in a couple of weeks, the Republic of Kenya turns 60. And so to David's point, we're now 60, we weren't there in the 50s and 60s. What's the story that needs to change from your perspective?
From my perspective, I think one story that needs to change is accountability. And this is because if we implemented all the policies and agreements and documents that we have in Kenya, around the world, I think we will have halfway solved all the problems that we're facing right now. Because we're not short of policies, we're not short of the documents that we try and create every day. We have all of that in paper. But the question is, why are we not doing what we already know that we need to do? So I think for me, it's about accountability. And this is because we've allowed even our leaders to just get away with everything. And that means that one person or a leader can come and speak about something that they are saying they're going to do, and then literally do do something different from what they said. So in Kenya, we say on the ground, it's different, right? So I think it has to be reflected, because we are living in a time when we have all the information we need, all the science that we need, all the impacts are real. We can see them. We can see them in the news. We can see them physically. People are facing them like right at their doorstep. And I think this is reason enough for us to just step up and do what we're supposed to do and do the right thing. That's why when I see international initiatives like making ecocide an international law, I think these are things that I'm really applaud, because we need to hold our leaders to account. That if we're saying that we are going to cut our emissions in our countries, or we're going to plant this number of trees in our countries, then I think that's what is supposed to be reflected on the ground. And if that doesn't happen, it should be made an obligation that if you don't do what you said you're going to do, then what is the implication? I think that is the biggest part that we're missing even from the COP processes. Like, people have no obligation, so you're free to say whatever you want to say that you're going to do, and if you don't do it, it's okay. That's why we had the first financing pledged in 2009, and the first funding came 12 years later in 2022. So, and we were just okay with it, you see. So I think for me, accountability is very key, and if we can work on accountability and make sure that we do more and, less talk, more doing, action on the ground, because we have everything that we need. If we just look at what's happening and do it with one heart, do it with an understanding that we're doing this for the people, for our planet, and even for our children.
Right. Thank you very much. I've learned one new word today, ecocide. Is Elsa in the audience? Elsa, I have a suggestion for you. Eldama mentioned that COP doesn't take place in 2 weeks. that it starts immediately the last COP ended. So we're here at an eco festival, and I'm curious whether, at least from a Kilifi perspective, whether there's room for some form of community engagement around the eco festival that ties in with COP, maybe, that gets the communities around the 35 wards of Kilifi understanding exactly what is going on. I'm told we're going to Brazil next year, so guys, please carry me along with you. So, just a suggestion, there's a conversation, great conversation that's come up from here. Ladies and gentlemen, give a round of applause to your great panel. Eldama, Dorcas, David and Elizabeth. I was your host, Tendai Mtana. Mic drop.